Theodore M. Shaw is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina School of Law at Chapel Hill. Professor Shaw teaches civil procedure and advanced constitutional law 14th Amendment. Before joining the faculty at UNC Law School from 2008 to 2014, Professor Shaw taught at Columbia University Law School, where he was professor of professional practice. Professor Shaw was the 5th Director Counsel and President of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, for which he worked in various capacities over the span of 26 years. He has litigated education, employment, voting rights, housing, police misconduct, capital punishment, and other civil rights cases in trial and appellate courts and in the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Shaw served on the Obama transition team after the 2008 election of President Obama as team leader for the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Professor Shaw is a giant in my eyes. His bio is included, and I haven't read even a small part of it. He's done a lot in his life. He's traveled the world. He's been making a difference, and he's in great demand. So I was really happy and surprised when he so quickly responded to my email and to my phone calls, and then just thoroughly delighted when he said, yes, I'll come to Peoria. So without further ado, I give you Theodore M. Shaw.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I'm honored to be here, but as you can see by looking at me, I'm no giant. My thoughts are, as I stand up here, that I need to keep myself in check, because once I get started, I can go. I have so much that I want to share with you, and then I see this presentation of a woman who's thinking about the issues of race and racism, and I know that I missed what you all did yesterday, and I'm sorry for that. I teach a constitutional law class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's actually on the 14th Amendment, so it's the stuff of which we speak here. And I take that obligation, of course, very seriously, so I couldn't leave until after I taught yesterday and was only able to get here for today. This is disjointed, but I'm compelled to share with you something that I just want you to know. I want you to know about this biography. It's disjointed, but I'll bring it back perhaps together. Maybe some of you know about this biography already. David Blight is one of our great contemporary historians. He wrote a wonderful book called Race and Reunion, which is about the United States in the years following the Civil War, and how the Civil War came to be redefined, how it came to be thought of, how the country came together after the Civil War, very much at the expense of African Americans. And That's a powerful and wonderful book. I said this is disjointed, but it really isn't. Because where I teach at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and Chapel Hill is a wonderful place to live, but North Carolina is still fighting the Civil War, at least some people are. You know, some of you may have heard, maybe not, about the battle going on at UNC with respect to a monument that was erected in 1913, funded by the Daughters of the Confederacy. Daughters of the Confederacy funded many things following the Civil War, part of the stuff of what David Blight wrote about, that helped to redefine what that war was about and what it was not about in the minds of not only many Southerners, but many Americans throughout the country. It wasn't about slavery, we were told. It was about states' rights. The lost cause narrative, noble lost cause. The Old South was a gentle place, a genteel place, where slaves were, in many respects, part of the family. They were, many of them, very happy with their lives and with their station in life. I could go on and talk about all of that. So in 1913, and this was going on in other places throughout the South, this statue was erected of a representative, hypothetical Civil War soldier from the University of North Carolina. It was supposed to represent those who went to fight on behalf of their home state, their home country. And the statue faced north. I suppose it was facing north to be ready and prepared for any new invasion from the north, the War of Northern Aggression, as it was called. So this statue stood on the campus of the University of North Carolina from 1913 until last August. And there are some who still want it to return. The statue is one that was dedicated with a speech by Julian Carr, whom none of you have heard of unless you happen to have spent some time in Chapel Hill or in Durham. Julian Carr was a leading citizen. He was an elected politician. There are buildings named after him at Duke, or at least there was until recently at Duke. There are, or his name is on the campus of the University of North Carolina. He gave a speech at the moment, he gave the dedication speech at the moment the statue was consecrated in a prized place on the campus of the University of North Carolina. And in that speech he talked about, he remembered when he came home from Appomattox after the surrender of the Confederate Army there. He said, less than 150 yards from where we now stand, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirt hung in shreds. because she had been disrespectful to one of the women, white women, of this village, and she fled to the university for sanctuary. Now, nobody knows who that woman was whom he horsewhipped. She, like many African Americans in the era of slavery and Jim Crow segregation in the South, is anonymous. I can't tell you how many places I've been where black folks who were in slavery are buried. Even on the campus of UNC, there's a university cemetery. Many of the luminaries of UNC are buried there. And you can go and read their names. Some of the names you know, they're on other buildings, etc. And in the corner, there's a black section. And there are these little stones with no names on them. That's all that's left to mark the lives of black folks who labored in slavery. Many of them helped to literally build the campus of UNC, the oldest university in the country that is a public university. I've been to cemeteries on or near plantations where black folks are buried in anonymity. No names. I can take you, if you would come with me, to a colored cemetery, as it's called, in Wilmington, North Carolina, where not only some of my folks are buried, including my father and my grandmother, my grandfather, family, but other folks who labored in slavery, buried in anonymity. Right next door, by the way, to the white cemetery, where I found out I also have an ancestor. Let that sink in for a moment. I don't need to explain any more than that. Not somebody who would have claimed me, not in that way. Why am I talking about all this? Well, the Frederick Douglass biography by David Blight, and I commend it to all of you to read. It's a fabulous book. I'm still in the middle of it. Is about someone who most Americans, even today, don't know. Some of you may remember that the current occupant of the White House said a couple of years ago something to the effect that Frederick Douglass is someone, I see you nodding, who's becoming better and better known, or something to that effect. But he said it in a way that made it sound as if he thought he was still alive. Maybe even that he was a football player or something. I think it was clear he had no idea who it was. And I think about the black folks who remain anonymous in spite of their place in history. David Blight writes that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in 19th century America. Think about that. If you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, you should. And there are many Americans who have no idea who he was, born into slavery in Eastern Maryland, eventually escaped slavery, went north, and in time became the most eloquent and powerful abolitionist speaker in the country. Someone who sat with Abraham Lincoln and urged him to create the 54th Regiment and other black regiments of soldiers who fought in the Civil War for their freedom. You know, freedom isn't given. You have to fight for it and you have to take it. Frederick Douglass, who was a feminist, an advocate, even though there was a time when there was a deep split between Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the great suffrage leader, because when the 15th Amendment was enacted, and also the 14th Amendment, there was reference to black suffrage, black male suffrage, but not women at that time. And yet Frederick Douglass, on the day of his death, attended a gathering of women in Washington, D.C., who were still fighting for the right to vote and equal treatment. The great Frederick Douglass, who was a minister to Haiti and served in other governmental posts. And most Americans, even today, don't know who he was. He was part of the second generation of founders of the United States. There was a second generation after the Civil War who brought the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment into being, and helped to write and etch in our greatest documents the principles of fairness and equality. That was Frederick Douglass, among many others, who are anonymous. Most people don't know who Charles Hamilton Houston was. Now, forgive me, I teach. I'm tempted to say, if you know who he was, raise your hand. There's a few, but the overwhelming majority of you don't know. This isn't a guilt trip. You know, we collectively as Americans don't know a whole lot about our history, period. We have this mythical history, but we don't know a lot about our history collectively. Charles Hamilton Houston, born in Washington, D.C., the son of a lawyer in the early part of the 20th century, who went to one of the nation's elite colleges even then. Can't say that and not think about the scandal that broke out last week or was uncovered last week. But he went to Amherst College in Massachusetts and graduated near the top of his class. This is in the 1920s or thereabouts. And went from there to Harvard Law School, an African American, in the 1920s. Dwell on that for a minute. Came back to Washington, D.C., went into practice with his father, did the kind of things that small practitioners did, wills, estates, criminal law, matrimony, small business matters, on and on. But he also started to take on cases for the NAACP. And in time, he began to teach on the side at a part-time law school in Washington, D.C. And through his work, it became a full-time law school accredited, Howard Law School. And he turned Howard Law School, because he became the dean, into a factory for producing civil rights lawyers. Among his star pupils, whom he mentored, Thurgood Marshall, in class of, I think, 31, maybe 32. Oliver O. Hill, who you probably don't know, but number 2 in that class, from Virginia, would litigate and argue civil rights cases throughout Virginia, and argued one of the 5 Brown cases, the Virginia case. One of the great lawyers, died at the age of 100 about 15 years ago. I remember he had gone blind. I used to say that Oliver Hill had lost his sight, but not his vision. So, anonymity. Charles Houston had as much effect on this country as a lawyer as any other lawyer who ever lived. You know, he was the engineer behind what became Brown versus Board of Education. And Brown versus Board of Education broke the back of Jim Crow segregation. No Charles Hamilton Houston, no Thurgood Marshall, no Oliver Hill, no one of the legions of lawyers who became the backbone of the civil rights legal bar. And yet most Americans don't know who he was. I thought about starting this speech in a way that I've often talked about. Didn't start it that way. But I want you to be conscious of, if you're not already, about where we are in history at this time in which, frankly, we are brought back like a puppy is brought back to that spot that it soiled. And we are having our noses put back into that spot in a way of chastising us or ourselves about this country's greatest sins. A few years ago, we were being told that we were post-racial America, that we were colorblind. Who can say that today, right now, in this country? Who can say it in the world, given what we've just seen in New Zealand? Who can say that? 400 years ago, this year, almost to the month, 400 years ago, the first Africans arrived in Jamestown. Now, because we're ahistorical in the United States, nobody's talking about that, or hardly anybody's talking about that right now. Yet I remember a few years back in 2007, there was a full year of commemoration of the establishment of the Jamestown colony. There were symposia at Colonial Williamsburg, speeches. The then President, Bush 43, came to Colonial Williamsburg to speak. The Queen came and checked on her former colony. A full year of activities, special license plates in Virginia, 400 years on it. People were so proud. If people could trace their ancestry back to that colony, they were blue blood Americans. They were also dishonest because that colony didn't survive. There are no known survivors, or were none. But there was a big deal in that commemoration. Okay, fine. I went and spoke on a panel there. It's part of American history. But why is it that that was commemorated and nobody is talking about commemorating the 400 years since the arrival involuntarily of the first Africans? That story isn't even known. They came the year before the Mayflower. And nobody knows what the names of the ships were that brought them here, or hardly anybody knows. The White Lion was one of those ships. The other one was the Treasurer. They came into the harbor that led up to Jamestown in late August of 1619, having been taken from a Spanish ship called the San Juan Batista that was attacked by these two British men of war. We know the Mayflower, we don't know the treasure. We don't know the White Lion. We don't know the story, but those were the first known African Americans in what became the United States. Stay with me for a minute on this. I could talk a lot more about that, but I won't right now. 400 years ago, out of those 400 years, 350 was spent by African Americans in legalized subordination in the form of slavery or Jim Crow segregation. How do I get those numbers? I count up until 1968, 69, the end of the Civil Rights Movement. Because up until then, in one way or another, it was legal to subordinate and discriminate against African Americans. If we were to go to Brown versus Board of Education, it would have been 335 years out of the 400 years. And we could use Brown because it was only at that moment that African Americans had the Constitution begin to mean what it was supposed to mean. And turn against legalized subordination. But that's too generous. Brown wasn't even implemented for at least another 17 years until the early 1970s. Not until 1964 was it illegal to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, and also on the basis of gender. It was only with the 1964 Civil Rights Act that discrimination in public accommodations became illegal. It was only with the 1964 Civil Rights Act that the federal government couldn't discriminate on the basis of race against African Americans. It was only until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that the 15th Amendment, enacted in 1870 and ratified then, began to have meaning, and black folks throughout the country, and particularly in the South, began to have a meaningful right to vote. It was only until 1967 that state laws that banned interracial marriages were struck down as unconstitutional. It was only until 1968, until after the death of Martin Luther King, that the Fair Housing Act was passed. I know that there's been a lot of talk recently and a lot written about Peoria and housing discrimination, among other things. Not illegal until 1968. If you do the math now, of those 400 years, if you use Brown as a cutoff point, we haven't been that long at the business of trying to address our history of legalized subordination of African Americans in slavery and Jim Crow segregation. In fact, if you use Brown, 83% of the days of African Americans in this country have been spent in either slavery or Jim Crow segregation. If you go up to the end of the Civil Rights Movement, 350 years, we're talking about 87% of the days of African Americans in what's now the United States in either slavery or Jim Crow segregation. Do the math yourself. Challenge me. Come back at me. Here's my point. We've not been long at the business of trying to address discrimination and racism. It's a mistake to think about all of this as being antiquated. Yes, the Civil War, we commemorated the sesquicentennial of the Civil War a couple of years ago, or the end of it, a few years ago. And, that wasn't that long ago in light of the rest of our history. And it's a mistake to think that we can separate out slavery from Jim Crow segregation. It was all part of a continuum. You know, I'm not the only one who can say this in this room, in this space today. But my paternal grandmother, she was a domestic worker. I suspect there are many of you in this room who are African American whose ancestors, mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers were domestic workers in the service of white folks, basically, just like in slavery. Only got paid a little something for it. Black men who had service jobs. I remember I was part of a team that litigated a school desegregation case in Kansas City, Missouri. It's a huge case. And the judge sat on the bench, and we were trying to put into evidence how segregated public schools, or the lack of public schooling, period, affected black folks who were still alive that day. And I had this black woman on the stand who wasn't able to go to high school because there was no high school for black folks in the suburban town in which she lived. If you went to high school, you had to either move into Kansas City or somebody would have to drive you in, and most people couldn't do that every day. And so she had ended up being a short-order cook. And I asked her at the end of and the lawyers were objecting, not relevant, and the judge was sustaining the objections repeatedly. For those of you who are lawyers, you know what you have to do then. To get this stuff in the record, you have to make a proffer because the judge isn't accepting it as evidence in the case, and so you're really building a record for the appeal. And finally, and the judge was very hostile to me for putting on this witness, among other things. And at the end of the testimony, my last question was, so what did you want to do when you were in high school? And they popped up, all these lawyers, and objected, and the judge sustained the objection. And the judge looked at me and said, when I asked about her ambitions at that time, "Oh, Mr. Shaw, you know better than that. You know that's not relevant. So many of us don't become what we want to become." And I remember, of course, you have to be respectful to the judge or the position in which he sat. But I remember in my mind at that moment thinking, ain't this and you could fill in the rest of it. Here's this man sitting on the bench in black robes as a federal judge, a lifetime appointment, clothed with great power. And his response to this black woman and her testimony and her ambitions is so many of us don't become what we want to become. I thought to myself, it never occurred to him that she maybe should be sitting where he is. So here's my point in all of this. Yes, we're still stuck with the legacy of race. We've only recently begun to address it. And massive inequality. The inequality that you all are wrestling with in Peoria and in this community. Oh, if I had time, I'd talk to you about what you maybe already know, which is that segregation in residential patterns and in education doesn't happen accidentally or fortuitously. It's a result of years and years and decades and hundreds of years of decisions by governmental actors on the local, state, federal level that interact with the actions of private individuals and institutions that create the patterns of segregation that we see today. How is it that black wealth, family wealth, is almost non-existent. You know, I think it's somewhere, and I'm probably wrong on the numbers. I meant to look it up again and didn't get to it. But black family wealth, somewhere the median family wealth for black families, I think it's somewhere around 10,000, maybe less. For white families, it's in six figures. How does that happen? Why? Is it because black people are lazy, irresponsible, don't save? I suggest that when we look at wealth, income, health, education, if we look across the board of all of the indicia that indicate well-being in this country, the gaps between African Americans and white Americans remain huge. They remain essentially what they were at the end of the era of segregation. Now, that's not true for all individuals. There's some black folks who have more money than God should allow. And that's not to say that we have not changed as a country, that we're not better than what we were, because we are. Don't misunderstand that. You know, don't get me wrong about that. But if we talk about institutionalized inequality across the board, it still is profoundly and significantly disparate. This isn't a guilt trip. I don't mean as a guilt trip for white folks. And I'm going to shift in a minute before I go somewhere else and then close. But it's truth. And the reality is we've only begun recently to address these inequalities. Not 10 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, not 10 years after the end of the Civil Rights Movement, I talked about all those laws that had to be enacted. Not 10 years after all of that, the Supreme Court decided one of the most important cases, as far as I'm concerned, in its history. University of California at Davis versus Bakke. It's one of the first so-called reverse discrimination cases the Supreme Court decided. I wish I had time to tell you about this case. This is a case in which the Supreme Court decided that diversity, the concept of diversity, was a compelling state interest. In other words, colleges and universities could consciously try to enroll students of color. I was a law student when Bakke was in the Supreme Court, and I was in the Supreme Court, end of the term, June 28th, 1978. So we knew the case hadn't come down yet, and it was going to be coming down. And so I was at the court the day that came down. I got into the courtroom, God knows how, I can't remember. But I remember I left the Supreme Court that day devastated by the Bakke case. Because contrary to what most people think, given that it upheld colleges and universities' rights to engage in diversity efforts, for African Americans at that moment, Bakke was a loss. Now you might ask, why do you say that? You know, the court said colleges and universities could try to enroll students of color. Here's the short of it. I'm really conscious of time running out on me right now, so I'll give you the shortest version I can. You all saw the Academy Awards recently, some of you saw, and you saw that, you know, Black Panther wasn't the best picture. You saw that some other cases, some other movies. There was another one, what was it, that involved black folks? Green Book I'm coming to. There was another one. Pardon me? I can't remember. So, but it did win. Yeah, Beale Street, James Baldwin. Green Book did win. Now, let me tell you, and this involves a personal admission. You know, my father wasn't much of a father. But I remember one day when I was a teenager, he sat me down and played this album for me. And I was enraptured by it. It's called The Gospel According to Don Shirley. And I started listening to Don Shirley that day, and I've listened to him all my days since. I love that album. You know, there's a version of I've Been Butte that just brings tears to my eyes all these years later when I listen to it. You know, I've been Butte, and I've been scorned, I've been spit upon, sure as I've been. But this is Don Shirley. What a great musician. I say all that to say that I love Don Shirley's music. But his family was upset with the movie. The lesson in that, by the way, is that if you want your story told, you better tell it. Because this was the story is told through the eyes of this white Italian-American gentleman from the Bronx who drove him through the South, and according to the movie, he taught Don Shirley about Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding and how to eat fried chicken, etc. That's absurd, with all due respect. And so it was another example of movies that purport to be about black people and their experiences told through the eyes of white folks. We are all the heroes of our own stories. What does this have to do with Baki, you might ask? I'm waiting for you all to ask. And by the way, there's a lot in that movie that I thought was profound, you know, that I thought was very worthwhile. There's a lot about the movie I like, but this part of it I didn't. It's like the movie, for you younger folks who won't remember this, there was a movie some years ago called Mississippi Burning, purporting to be based on the story of the murders of 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black in Mississippi, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. And in that movie, the FBI is the hero of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. Now, the FBI was many things during the civil rights era and in Mississippi also, but it was not the hero of that movement, with all due respect. Ironically, there are many of us who've been very concerned about the well-being of the FBI these days. But here's the thing. That story was told that way, the help story, told through the eyes of this young white. I'm not saying there aren't stories to be told through the eyes of these folks, but Hollywood for a long time has been lifting up those movies above movies by black folks, or they refuse to tell those stories, to even film them. They couldn't even get to screen. What does this have to do with Baki? That's what the Supreme Court did in the Baki case. The Supreme Court basically threw the remedial rationale under the bus. The rationale that truly began opening the doors to colleges and universities to people, particularly African Americans, but not exclusively, who had been kept out for so long. Right? That was, if you know, for those of you who are lawyers or if you are students of the law, that was grounded in the 14th Amendment's struggle, equal protection for the rights of African Americans. Basically, the court said, and I don't have time to tell you all that it said, but it said that that's not what we're going to recognize anymore. In fact, Justice Powell's opinion, which was a diversity opinion, straddled two camps. Wish I could explain that some more, but the diversity rationale belonged to the colleges and the universities. Their interest in admitting students of color so that they get the benefit. In other words, white students, really, and the university get the benefit of having those students there. You get an indirect benefit to black students and brown students because they got to be there to create the diversity. But that's grounded in the First Amendment, interest in academic freedom, not in the 14th Amendment struggle on behalf of black folks. You get what I'm saying? And as a consequence, you might ask, so what's the difference? Well, it's not that I'm against diversity. I have fought to preserve diversity against attacks in cases like the Michigan cases and in other cases. I've been deeply involved in these struggles. But that wasn't the original rationale. And if you think about the cases that are now pending, as we continue to have these attacks on these efforts, there are two cases pending, one against Harvard, one against UNC. Who are the parties? It's white people who didn't get in, suing institutions that are controlled by white people. There are no voices of black and brown people in these cases. Their lawyers are not even arguing, regardless of the color of their lawyers, whether they're white lawyers arguing on their behalf or black and brown lawyers, Latino. They're not even giving argument time in these cases before the Supreme Court because their arguments aren't being credited. It's the university's arguments. You get it? Profound consequences of that. Let me close on this. I think about all of this and so much more that I wish I had time to talk about. But I stand here before you. Look at me. I tell my wife all the time, I'm a mud of a man. You get me? What I mean by that is clearly I'm not just African American, although deep in my soul, I'm a black man. But I'm many other things. Why do I say this? Our story as Americans is one that we don't even fully understand or like to talk about. We are more interrelated than what we know. But it's uncomfortable to talk about the ways in which we are. I can't or haven't been able to identify any white person in my family after slavery. Let me repeat that. I've done a lot of genealogical work. I have not yet. I'm not saying they're not there, but I filled in most of the spots. There are a few that may be in the category of those who know don't tell and those who tell don't know. But I haven't found any white people after slavery. I have identified some white ancestors and families that I'm related to through the slavery era. Skip Gates, some of you may know, he got me started on some of this, and so I've identified some of that. I think about this all the time. I think about who we are as a country, who we are as individuals, who we are as people, who we are as a society. Why is North Carolina still fighting the Civil War? Why are people thinking that we collectively should be honoring folks who the 14th Amendment said should not be allowed to hold public office after the Civil War, serve in the military, unless they got a dispensation from Congress because they engaged in what? Treason. They fought against our country, and yet we are supposed to honor them, or at least we collectively, and particularly African Americans, shouldn't be fighting against these honors to these individuals. People tell us that's our legacy, it's our family, it's our history. It's not because the Civil War was about slavery. It wasn't. Well, that's not true. And we don't have to honor everything that our ancestors did. I do not honor my slave-holding ancestors who had their way with black women who were slaves. That's the story of Frederick Douglass. If you read this book, that's the story of America. Do you remember a few years ago in the 2008 campaign? That's the year Barack Obama was elected. There was a white politician in, I think in Missouri, I may be wrong, who wanted to run for the Senate. He was in the House, and part of his campaign was about abortion and choice, and he made an incredibly ignorant statement that, to the effect that there's something that is nature's defensive mechanism if someone is raped that prevents that individual from, that woman, from becoming pregnant. Anybody remember that? And people righteously became angry. What I thought at that time that nobody talked about is that there are millions and millions of African Americans whose very countenances today, right now, put to lie to what he said. Exhibit A. That's our history in this country. That's who we are. Does it mean that we should be stuck in guilt and antipathy toward one another? No, it doesn't mean that. But it means that we should do some truth-telling, truth and reconciliation, as South Africa got it. You know, the woman who was up there on that video, children begin to learn about race and color almost immediately. When we talk about racism, it's not just white folks who are racist. Black folks tragically have had racism internalized within our families. We've had colorism internalized within our family. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Maybe not everybody knows, but the black folk in this room know what I'm talking about. I was at Michigan some years ago giving a talk with Cornell West, and some white student got up and he said very sincerely, "I don't have any racism in me." And Cornell, God bless him, said correctly, "With all due respect, young man," he was trying to be gentle with him. He said, "Every day of my life, I've had to consciously work to filter out and get out of me, to expunge the racism that I've been taught against my own people and myself. Every day, because we've internalized it also. We've been taught that. It's not only white people who were taught that, we've internalized it." And he said, "So I know if I have to fight racism within myself, I know you do have to fight it, with all due respect." He was absolutely right about that. We're still struggling with the legacy of that 400 years, those 400 years. We're still struggling with racism that we see coming out almost every day in all kinds of ways, law enforcement, etc. So we won't deal with this stuff by chance. We won't do it serendipitously. We have to be conscious of it and deliberate about it. We have to commit ourselves every day to confront racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia every day. We all have this responsibility to do it. I close with this. I love this country. This is my country. Those of you who are my age remember Curtis Mayfield. right? This is my country. But if there's anybody in this country who has the right to criticize this country, it's African Americans. Now, to be clear, we all do, all of us as Americans, but it's African Americans. Go read Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech if you haven't. It's searing. It's an indictment against this country. But he loved this country. If anybody has a right to kneel, take a knee. And I still am struggling with how that becomes disrespectful to the flag. It's African Americans. But to be clear, we all have the right to criticize this country, just as is true of individuals. You know, the people who love us most and best are those who love us in spite of who and what we are, not always because of it. And that's true with respect to all of us as Americans. So in this 400th year, there's still a lot to commemorate, just to celebrate, but there's a lot to do to truly make this country a more perfect union. That's the one thing the founders got right. You know, that we weren't perfect, but that the Constitution's charge was to make our country, a more perfect union. Thank you.
Will you take a few questions? Will you take a few? We got time, yes. We have time for about 3 or 4 questions for Professor Shaw from the audience. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you.
So, Professor Shaw, you talked about that African Americans have spent 83%.
Hold on a second. Oh, there you are. I'm sorry.
I told you I was going to ask you something. Okay, so you said that African Americans have spent 83% of the 400 years either in slavery or Jim Crow. Can you tell us what your position is on reparations?
Yeah, so thank you. There was an interesting piece in the New York Times, an op-ed written a couple of weeks ago by one of their regular op-ed writers, in which he talked about having, he traveled around the country recently. And as he traveled around the country, you know, he was doing it in part because this is a time of such great divisiveness, division in our country. Plus, so many people who feel they've been left out of the American dream, the promise of having your children in a better place than where you were. So that's where he started out. But he said that he couldn't shake from his mind something he didn't plan to go and think about and look at, which was all across the country, he could see the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation in African Americans. And by the way, we've never been a biracial country, although the black-white divide has been often the great divide. But whether we're talking about Latinos, Asian Americans, whether we're talking about Native Americans, I'm unashamed in talking about the legacy of this country with respect to slavery and race, but don't get it twisted. I'm conscious that we've never been a biracial society, and we have to talk about all these groups who have also been subordinated. So I think about those groups. I think about Native Americans. My wife and our 2 children are registered in the Shawnee, Eastern Shawnee of Oklahoma tribe, and we're going to go to Oklahoma, which we're prepared to, be in some ways a depressing journey given the conditions of Native Americans. Reparations, it's been telling that anybody who raised that discussion, as many people have, think about John Conyers, who had a reparations bill in Congress, people just laughed at you. And yet, reparations when it came to those who were interned in prison camps who were Japanese Americans, that wasn't ludicrous. Reparations for, and in other contexts, in Europe, for those impacted by the Holocaust, certainly we don't think about that as ludicrous. I could get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's true. I get why Jews after the Holocaust advocated for the establishment of a Jewish state. That didn't start with World War II, but it didn't come to fruition until after World War II because of the Holocaust. Reparation. But black folks hadn't happened. And most people didn't take it seriously. Yes, there were all kinds of difficult questions. Do you give it to individuals? Do you give it to communities? In what form? 40 acres and a mule didn't happen. Now do you do 40 acres and a Lexus? Tongue in cheek. The point being that, yes, there are a lot of difficult questions. But the gaps, wealth and otherwise, between white families and black families in this country, still huge, directly traceable to that legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, We all have our individual stories. I said something about my father, but he was in the Air Force. When he got out of the Air Force, he had been a mechanic, a jet, fighter jet mechanic, and he tried to get a job with an airline. They weren't hiring any black mechanics. That was good money, so he didn't get that job. And I don't mean to in any way denigrate the jobs that he did. He worked for the post office most of his life, like many of us do. But he would have been in a different place. And we all have those stories one way or another. Reparations, some of that you can't go back and make up. I guess I'd feel better if we had a kind of psychic set of reparations at the very least, a truth and reconciliation. At least tell the truth about this country's history and about race and racism and subordination, as a starting place. But should we be putting money into communities that have been impoverished and that are impacted by concentrations of poverty? Yes, we should be doing it. Instead, what we fight about are, whether it's even proper to do things like, affirmative action, as pithy as that is, not the best word, but as small as that is. We fight about whether we should do things that people call welfare. Whether we should support or provide support for families that struggle in poverty, that are born into poverty, the accident of birth, etc. Do I believe in reparations? Philosophically, yes. In what form? That's a struggle. How does it manifest? That's a struggle. But it's a struggle worth thinking about. So that's the best but imperfect answer that I can give you right now. Reparations would be righteous in this country. Are we going to see them?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shaw. We're going to take one question from a student, and then we're going to move to our moderators.
Because I went on so long in answering that.
One student question. I see a student right up here.
Hi. First, just want to say thanks for speaking. It was really insightful and wonderful to listen to. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And I guess my question is, as a white student and just as a white kid, like, where do I start with helping to, make those reparations and just working for civil rights in general? Like, where do I start, I guess?
Well, that's a, thank you for that question. Again, I don't have a perfect answer for that, but here's what comes to mind. I often think about the language. I didn't get a chance to say everything I could have said about diversity and that rationale. I think about the language of diversity, and I hear people all the time, and I cringe, they describe themselves or others as diverse people. You ever hear that? People do that terminology? If you have, raise your hand. I just want to get a sense of... And I cringe because while I support the idea of diversity, as people, what do we mean when we say diverse people? What we're really meaning, what people usually mean is that they're talking about black and brown people. And my problem with that is that it doesn't include people who are described or who describe themselves as white people. If I had more time, I'd tell you what my challenge is on the issue of, or the description of white people, because that's another thing that we can discuss. But the reason that I think it's a problem to talk about diversity in the way we do with diverse people is it lets some people off the hook. We are all part of diversity. We all bring something to the table. Who and what we are. It's like we're a mosaic. And it's a mistake for people who are described or describe themselves as white folks to think that they are not part of the diversity we talk about. Because it's inclusive. It's all inclusive. So here's what I think I can say to your question. In addition to that, I think we all have an obligation to confront the isms that we see. When we see it, on the spot. I remember being on the subway in Brooklyn many years ago, and I got onto the subway, and something was going on, as is often true in the subways in New York. But people were yelling and cursing, and there were 2 or 3 Orthodox Jewish men who were being attacked verbally by several people who happened to be white. And they were saying to them, "You stink," and this, and just saying the most awful and hateful things. And nobody was saying anything. And I thought to myself, what are these men thinking? Do they think that everybody in this subway car either agrees with these folks or they don't care? What do they think is going on? And yet, how do you respond? And so I said, the only thing I could think of to say, no matter how lame it might have been, which was, shame on you. And they turned on me and spoke to me in French for a few moments. And all I could do was repeat, shame on you. And I've often thought about that. In the moment, we all have to confront racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, as I said before, instantly, in the moment. We can't laugh uncomfortably about, at the jokes that people tell at other people's expense. We have to say that's not funny. That's sexist, for us who are men, because we're challenged, So as I said, as lame as that might be, I've come to believe that deeply. And I just encourage you to think, as you are thinking, that these responsibilities belong to all of us. You know, this is not the stuff of black and brown people or of women or, you know, I mean, we are all responsible for carrying this stuff and getting it right. In ourselves, in our families, in our homes, and in our communities, and in the institutions to which we belong.
Thank you, Professor Shaw.
It'd be great if you became a civil rights lawyer, too.